Our first speaker today is Rivka Weinberg. She is a professor of philosophy at Scripps College in Claremont, California. Her book, The Risk of a Lifetime, How, When, and Why Procreation May Be Permissible, is very much to the point of this conference. She's currently working on a book on meaning and the human condition. And she's going to speak on gamete donation and parental responsibility.
Hi, thank you for being here. Today I'm going to be discussing gamete donation and really it's gamete sale, as people noted yesterday. And I've written about this issue, but my discussion today is going to draw on what I've written before and expand a little bit and address some of the objections to my view, and to also talk a little bit more, more deeply on what rights are and what parental responsibilities are. So I'm going to begin by outlining my view, and sorry to those of you who know it already. And then I'm going to address some objections to it and some implications of it. And I just want to note that my view, which does attribute parental responsibility to gamete donors, is so far from the current practice that even if you're not completely persuaded by my view, it will at least push you more toward abolishing anonymity and some of the other practices, to reconsider whether not just anonymity, but how reckless the abdication of responsibility is. People give their gametes away and they don't know who they're going to, and there's nothing more that is needed to get a gamete than the money to buy one. So that's a really low level of care in that kind of transfer. Okay, so since I'm talking about parental responsibility, let me talk about what it is. Parental responsibility is the responsibility to play the parental role in a child's life, which means to raise, nurture, and nurture a child, helping her to an adulthood of realized potential. And of course, loving that child, because a child needs love in order to grow to her potential, and a sustained relationship with a loving caregiver seems really necessary, just empirically, to be a necessary part of that growth. So that's a really big responsibility, parental responsibility. And in my view, it's one that can rarely be permissibly transferred to somebody else. But I'll get to that later. Okay, so before I discuss my view of parental responsibility, I told you what it is and how it's incurred. I'm going to talk about some of the other views, and some of it was touched on yesterday, but some of the other kinds of theories of what makes somebody parentally responsible. So many people argue that parental responsibility is incurred voluntarily. And so that can seem reasonable, because we usually don't hold people responsible for things they did that they couldn't control, right? And that's one reason why voluntary commitments make sense. And another reason is because when somebody does volunteer for something, we usually do hold people responsible to uphold their commitments. So that's why this kind of view is appealing. But what's problematic about this theory of parental responsibility is that it doesn't tell us what counts as volunteering for this kind of responsibility, right? Do I have to agree explicitly? Do I have to sign something, right? If I have to have this kind of explicit agreement or very clear intent, then you're going to have a lot of children that have nobody parentally responsible for them, because a lot of children are born accidentally or without any kind of clear intent or explicit commitment. So that's one problem. And another problem with the voluntary view of parental responsibility is that if all it takes to have parental responsibility, and of course the rights that that I agree with come along with it, then anyone can say, well, I intended to parent this child, or this is my child because I had volunteered for it. And so these are some of the problems with the theory of voluntarism, which gives you kind of a necessary condition. You shouldn't be held responsible for something completely out of your control, but it doesn't really tell you what counts, or it doesn't tell you enough of what counts as a voluntary commitment of this kind. Another common theory for what grounds parental responsibility is geneticism. genetically speaking, right? Just as in the rest of the animal kingdom, the genetic parents are the parents, and so they're usually held responsible to the child. The only problem with this is that if we can imagine someone stealing, right, if somebody came into your room in the middle of the night and extracted your eggs or extracted your sperm and made a baby with it, then it wouldn't seem fair to hold you parentally responsible, because that is a real violation of a voluntary commitment and something that happened totally outside of your control, and it can seem unfair to then say, well, you have to raise this child that you had nothing voluntarily to do with its existence. And so it seems, that seems to be incorrect. If you're thinking about geneticism, you have to think about which aspects are voluntary, which aspects are not, even though it is consistent with biology and with the rest of, even when a cell splits into two cells, we call the two cells the daughter cells, right? So that is certainly the biological relationship, but in order for it to be the moral relationship, we have to have the element of some kind of voluntariness. Another view about how parental responsibility is incurred is gestationalism, right? Proponents of gestationalism argue that the labor and the risk of gestation, as well as the attachments that can form during pregnancy, argue in favor of using gestation as the determinant of parental responsibility and parental rights because of the labor and the investment. But one of the problems with this view is that implicitly it treats children as property. It's like using Locke's theory of property. Well, who owned this? Well, who worked for this? But a child is not property. So that already, to me, kind of argues against this view, that it's not just like who worked for this, who owned this. A child is not something that you own. Another problem with gestationalism is that it focuses more on parental rights than on responsibilities. It's like, well, you have this right because you've gestated the child. Another, I think, a really deep problem with gestationalism is that it ignores fathers' rights and responsibilities completely. So their role is just wholly derivative of their relationship with whoever is gestating the child. And that's not what we do with other cases of pregnancy, with accidental pregnancy. You can sue somebody for child support. And if gestationalism is true, then the father can say, well, I had this, fleeting relationship, and I'm not with this woman anymore at all. So how am I, what right? I have no rights, and so I should also have no responsibilities. And that's, a flaw in the theory. And another problem with gestationalism is what motivated gestationalism was the rights of surrogates in surrogacy cases. So they say, well, they did the labor, they gestated the baby, they have certain rights. But again, those are property kind of rights. They ignore the fathers. And it could also leave many children with not only questionable, like who is parentally responsible to them, but conceptually, at least, no one parentally responsible to them. Because, what if we gestate babies almost completely in incubators, 100 years from now, 300 years from now? It's not inconceivable. The time that children can gestate sort of okay in incubators keeps getting pushed back. It's not inconceivable. And then will nobody be parentally responsible to these children? So that's another problem with the view that whoever gestates the child has the responsibility and the rights, parental responsibilities for the child. An alternate to gestationalism is the causal account, right? And so when we see this tiny little person desperately in need of lots of care, it can seem natural to ask, right? Whose fault is this? Right? Who did this? Who caused this problem? And that can seem to point you, right, to the person, right? So if you see a glass of milk knocked over on the floor, you want to know who spilled the milk. That's the person who gets to wipe it up, right? So there's an intuitive, a very compelling aspect to the causal account, right? So we can say, well, who caused this child? That's the person who's responsible for it. The problem is that causation is multifaceted, and it leads to this, can lead you deep into this rabbit hole of of a regress of causal factors. Even if we try to narrow it down to primary causation or proximate causation, in law you see the concept of proximate cause, right? It just means near, and there's a lot of debates even because of what it means. And some causal theorists talk about proximal cause when they're talking about parental responsibility. And when I was researching this, and I'm in general also interested in causation, so I'm thinking like, what is proximate cause? And I'm reading about it, and I can't get a handle on it. So I decide to call a friend of mine who was in law school at the time, who's really very smart. Oh, actually, I think maybe she had just graduated, and she really had a good grasp on things. And I didn't want to prejudice the conversation, so I was just like, hello, it's Rivka. What is proximate cause? That was the And she answered me. She said, "It's just making stuff up." That is what she said, which is true, right? It's like, well, this is closer, that's closer. So even if we would try to say this is proximate, that's proximate, nobody really knows what that means. And if you think about the way babies are created and born, there are some people that seem more proximately or closely caused by like blackouts or whoever ordered the round of free drinks at the bar than anything else, right? And so most babies are caused by an interweaving and complex causal chain, including the actions of their grandparents, the parents, their doctors, their cultures, sporting events, scheduling, the weather. And so causation spreads parental responsibility too widely and too indiscriminately. And so we need a finer grain theory, similar to the objection that I had to voluntarism. It's not that having volunteered for an obligation is divorced from your obligation. It's not that playing a causal role is divorced from the obligation. It's just not enough. It doesn't tell you enough. So we need something a little more fine-grained, a little more specific. And so enter my theory, more fine-grained and specific, although a little explosive in its title. And I argue for the hazmat theory of parental responsibility because I think that gametes are this hazardous material that we have. So what is so hazardous about a gamete? What is dangerous about it is that a gamete can join with another gamete and grow into a needy, vulnerable person with full moral status. And so they're this hazardous material under the possession and control of each person. And just as with other hazardous materials under our possession and control, we're responsible for what happens to them. And so this is consistent with our moral and even our legal standards for the responsibility and the risks that we take and impose with dangerous possession that under our control, with hazardous materials that we possess and that we control. There's a high standard of care for that. So, for example, a car is a very dangerous possession. It's under your control. You possess and control the car. Then if you choose to drive it in the rain and you skid into a pedestrian, we might say, well, now you have to pay for this. We have to mitigate the damages or do something to address the risks that you chose to take with this hazardous possession under your control. And so, again, gametes are like this. They're this hazardous possession under our control, and they can join with others and grow into this needy, vulnerable person with full moral status. And so owning them is a really serious responsibility, right? It's like owning a pet lion or, inheriting enriched uranium from your aunt who turned out to be like more eccentric than you had expected, right? So what are you going to do? Now you have the uranium. You can't just say like, well, sorry, now it's under your possession and control. You have to exercise a high standard of care with what you do with it. So we can't just leave the dangerous things that we own and control. You can't just leave this stuff lying around, right? You can't do things that put your gametes at risk of joining with others and growing into a baby unless you're prepared to mitigate the damages and raise the baby. Okay, so let's take a moment to talk about a little bit more about risk and responsibility. Risk and responsibility are woven into our moral and legal and social systems based on the interests of the people involved. And because in the course of our daily lives, we have to impose risks on other people. Even just breathing imposes a risk on somebody else. And we are also subject to being harmed by the risks that other people impose on us. And so we have to sort of adjudicate this conflict of interest. We have to attend to our interests in being free to do things we want to do, which impose risks on others, and our interest in being safe and secure and not being unduly harmed by the risks that other people take, which impose the risk of harm on us. And so, right, and so we want to ensure our freedom, we want to ensure our security, we want to be able, so when do we want to engage in risk? We usually permit risks when people have a strong interest in doing the activity. So people want to drive, you want to have sex or sell your gametes, but people don't want to be harmed by these acts. We don't want to be crashed into, we don't want to catch the plague, we don't want to be born needing constant and care and love without people strictly and specifically responsible to take care of us. So one way to adjudicate this kind of conflict of interest is to think about the costs and the benefits at stake for the parties to the conflict, to think about, well, what would it cost me to refrain from imposing this risk? Or what would it cost me if I am harmed by somebody else imposing this risk? And so this can help us set the standard of care for this act, right? So when it comes to driving, we think, what would it cost us not to drive? For a lot of people, it will cost a lot. You have to get to work, you have to get to where you want to go, your life, so that's a high cost to not drive. It's also a high cost to be hit by someone else's car. And so we set a standard of care for driving that's pretty high. You have to be licensed, you have to be insured, you can't drive drunk, you can't be too tired. And so that's our high standard of care for this act. And if you don't meet that standard, then you're negligent. And this is a way of adjudicating the conflict and that we all have between our liberty and our security, between our need to impose risks on other people and our need to not have risks unduly imposed on us so that we're not, harmed. So if we think about something like breathing, right? When we breathe, we impose risks on everybody else, but the cost of having to walk around with a mask is a high cost, and usually nobody's going to, be seriously ill from whatever everyday germs you pass on. But if we think about if there's suddenly like an epidemic, we might change the standard, right? If there's a flu pandemic, although I think the masks didn't help anybody in the flu pandemic because they were not the right kind of mask or something like that. But the point is that if there's a change in the cost benefit of the risk and the harm, we might make a change, right? So the cost of not being eaten by a lion is greater than the cost of having to pick an alternate pet, right? So we say you can't have a pet lion. Sorry, find something else to do because that's just too high of a risk to impose on other people. So I argue that the cost of being born without specific people highly responsible to and committed to your care is greater than the cost of this of cost-free engagements and acts that risk creating a child from your gametes. So in my view, parental responsibility is the cost and also the reward of the risks that we choose to take with the hazardous materials, our gametes, under our possession and control. So that is the view that I defend today. Okay, so what are some of the advantages of this hazmat view of parental responsibility? One advantage is that it's consistent with our system of moral, legal, and societal norms for risky behavior and standards of care for the dangerous things under our possession and control. And I think that's actually a very strong advantage because if you look at some of the other theories of parental responsibility, they seem to be kind of ad hoc. It's like, well, we want this result, so let's work backwards and see what theory we can generate out of it, which is kind of it's just not a really respectable way of thinking about what you think your theory should be. Start with what you think what makes sense in terms of what we should be responsible for, and then see how it turns out. So that I take it to be an advantage of the hazmat view that it fits into a framework of how we think about what our responsibilities are for this dangerous materials or hazardous materials that we possess and control more generally. It is also consistent with the high level of responsibility that we usually assign to people who allow their gametes to become people, right? It's why we hold people parentally responsible for children that result from birth control failure or too much alcohol or too little judgment, right? Ignorance is not an excuse for what happens when the dangerous materials under your possession and control are misused or get away, because part of the responsibility you have when you own something so dangerous and you control something so dangerous is to figure out how to take care of it, right? So that's part of the responsibility. You have to foresee what's going to happen with your pet lion. You can't say, well, I built a gate. It was a high gate. You have to think of this in advance. This is a high level of responsibility. So when the hazmat view of parental responsibility is consistent with the high level of responsibility that we usually assign to people who allow their gametes to become people, even if it wasn't intended. It's foreseen. And usually we hold people responsible for what is a foreseeable result of what they do, not just what is an intentional result of what they do. It's also consistent, the hazmat view is also consistent with the fact that we don't hold fertility doctors or oyster bars parentally responsible. Why not? They're also involved in the causal chain, sometimes very crucially involved in the causal chain. They also have voluntarily do what they do. They know what they're doing. They intend for what they're doing. I mean, not the oyster bar owner, but a fertility doctor to create children. And But what the difference is that the difference between somebody who owns an oyster bar or a fertility doctor is that they don't possess the rights of ownership and control over the gametes that they might manipulate. Right, so they're not the ones who own and control the hazardous materials. And so, unlike causal theories, the hazmat theory specifically targets a particular act or a set of actions that do a specific thing, right? They impose a risk with a dangerous possession under somebody's control, and it's therefore consistent with our norms of risk and responsibility. And it also avoids, the hazmat theory also avoids a lot of the pitfalls that other theories fall into. It doesn't leave children with too many parents, like the voluntarist or intentional theory can, right? This was my baby, I intended for it. And it doesn't leave children with too many or too few parents, right? I did not intend for this. You even sometimes see this in cases of sperm donation where the person conceives twins, and it's like, well, I only ordered one, right? Nobody ordered the second baby, so that's, or I only ordered a healthy baby, so this was not my intention. Or people write in abortion clauses which are unenforceable because you can't force somebody to have an abortion. And there have been cases like that where there was some health problem with the child, and these are surrogacy cases. The surrogate doesn't want to have an abortion, and the commissioning couple says, well, it's in our contract. This is not the kind of child that we have agreed to accept. And there was a case like this recently where the surrogate had the child and is raising the child, a genetically unrelated child. But if you look at the hazmat view, it doesn't leave children with too many parents, but it also doesn't leave children with too few parents, and it does not hold people responsible for involuntary acts, for stolen sperm, stolen eggs, things like that. So those are the advantages. Now let's look at some of the disadvantages or some of the challenges to the view. So here are some, what I take to be some lesser worries about the hazmat view. So some people argue that the hazmat view veers into involuntary responsibility because we didn't volunteer to be born with these gametes that lurk inside us, and we have this drive to let them out, and they're capable of breaching a lot of our gates. And so it seems like there's a voluntariness problem because we didn't ask, right? The same way you didn't ask to inherit the enriched uranium from your aunt, you didn't ask to be born with gametes, and they love getting out. That's what they want to do. And they love joining with others, also what they want to do, right? So that can seem to cut into the voluntary aspect of the hazmat theory of parental responsibility. But I think it's not just our bare possession of gametes that makes us potentially parentally responsible for them if they grow into persons. It's our control over them. It's the risks we choose to take with them. And we can go pretty far in reducing these risks, right? We can use 2 forms of birth control, or even 1 properly, right? And that can really mitigate our risks. Or if you really don't want to be a parent, you can surgically interfere with your gamete release systems. And those are very high, that's pretty reliable. It's not so hard not to have a baby if you take the steps that are needed to not have a baby. Another worry about the hazmat view is it seems to deny the importance of genetic, gestational, or intentional ties. What about, I don't know why I call that voluntary responsibility. I think that's the wrong title for this kind of worry. It's more the worry that we're ignoring other important aspects of parental responsibility or these other kinds of ties. But I don't ignore those ties. I think genetic ties are important. I think gestational ties can also be important, and so can intentional ties. I'm just denying that those are the kinds of connections that give rise to parental responsibility, of the kind of responsibility that I've outlined. Another worry about the hazmat view is that the standard of care is too high. Some people say that because it involves this high cost of trying to rein your gametes in. It requires us to be these gamete police constantly on guard for a rogue gamete. And Andrew Botterell argues along these lines, and he invokes, and I'll explain this a little bit for those unfamiliar to it, he invokes a familiar argument against abortion, in favor of the permissibility of abortion, which is an article written in 1971 by Judith Jarvis Thompson. And in that article, she argues that abortion is permissible, and her argument really is that the right to life does not include the right to use someone else's body to sustain your life. But she uses this very well-known now case where she says, well, imagine if you fell asleep and you woke up plugged into this violinist, and somebody told you that the violinist, in order to live, and it wasn't the violinist's fault either. People did this when you were all not noticing or in your sleep, and now you're plugged into this violinist. You have to stay plugged in for 9 months to sustain the violinist's life, and most people think the intuition is, no, you don't have to stay plugged in. And so Thompson draws the analogy to a pregnancy, and she says, you don't have to, this is not what is required of you for other people. You don't have to let somebody else use your body to sustain your life. An objection to Thompson is like, well, you don't just wake up pregnant, like you wake up attached to a violinist. Like, you did some stuff first. You volunteered. And so when she replies to that objection, she says, okay, you volunteered, but what counts as volunteering? And she says, imagine if babies just blew, like seeds, just blew in through your windows and took roots in your carpets and started to grow. Would we then say you're responsible for them? Right? How much is enough to say, well, we put up a gate, we put up a screen, right? Would we hold parents responsible for the resulting children? And so Botterill argues that my view, the hazmat view, is similar to this objection, to Thompson's reply. It's like, okay, we put up a fence, but it breached the fence. What if children were like seeds that blew through your window and took roots in your carpet? Well, yes, then we might have a different view, because then they would be these dangerous possessions that you have, but they would be not really under your control. But the fact is that gametes do not behave that way. They don't blow through your window and take roots in your carpets. They're in our possession and control, and we can pretty much control them. They're not so hard to control. Again, you can use 2 forms of birth control at the same time, or even 1 form the right way, and it's very unlikely that you're going to get pregnant. And so as applied to, or you can have a vasectomy or have your tubes tied if you really don't want. It's not like it's not uncontrollable. You do have a high degree of control, but moreover, as applied to gamete donation, this objection to the hazmat theory is weakest when you apply it to gamete donation, because it's very easy not to donate a gamete, right? That is very easy. So it is not at all hard to control that aspect of the gametes under your possession and control. So it certainly does. So to whatever extent this argument applies to the hazmat theory of parental responsibility, and I don't think it applies that well, because I think that, yeah, if it was the case that this is how children were born, they just blew through your window and grew from your carpets, then yes, that would not be, those would not be dangerous possession that you owned or controlled. So I don't find that really an analogy. But even if you did, it doesn't apply to gamete donation, because gamete donation is something that you do, right? A gamete sale is something that you do. So those, I think, are the lesser worries about the hazmat view. And let me turn now to some of what I take to be the deeper worries, or the things that are harder to address. So even if gamete donors are initially parentally responsible for the resulting children, you might think, okay, they're initially responsible, and then the responsibility is transferred to the gamete recipients, right? Just as parental responsibility is transferred in cases of adoption. Right, so we have this analogy to adoption that challenges the view that gamete donors are parentally responsible, because we have this other case where we see parental responsibility as transferable. And so why isn't gamete donation a case of the transfer of responsibilities? So, one of the problems I have with this idea of transferring parental responsibilities is that one of your responsibilities as a parent is to love your child. So because your parental responsibility includes this responsibility to love and raise a child, to provide for their basic needs, and love is one of those needs, I don't think that kind of responsibility, which is the responsibility to relate to another person with a particular kind of feeling, is easily transferable, because it is a responsibility for a highly specific and unique performance. And it's a responsibility for something that different people do very differently. And so when you promise to love somebody, it's your love that is promised or that is required, not somebody else's. And so it's hard to see how we can transfer a responsibility to personally relate to another person with a particular emotion. And it's hard to see how easily or unproblematically we can transfer responsibility for a specific performance that different people do differently, right? That's why, right, so let's say you're supposed to bake a cake, you bake these fabulous cakes with your recipes that nobody knows, and you decorate them so beautifully, and you're supposed to bake a cake for your friend's wedding. Well, and you're going to bring the cake. Well, if you send somebody else to deliver the cake, that's fine, right? Because anybody delivers a cake like the same way. You just bring over the cake. But if you would agree to bake the cake, and then you just send over a cake that somebody else baked, you didn't really follow through, right? Because what was ordered was your cake. You bake special cakes in your special way, right, with your special cake sauce. And so that is different. We would be even more bothered. Let's say you hire a comedian to perform, and the comedian's really funny, but they send somebody else instead. Well, comedians are very different. Different styles are different. Different senses of humor are different. And so it's a unique and a personal performance. And so when you incur parental responsibility and the included responsibility to love your child, it seems that it's your love that's required, not just someone's, not because it's a unique responsibility and it's a relational responsibility, right? It's a responsibility that entails standing in a particular emotion to another person. And so once you have this responsibility, like, okay, I have a responsibility to stand in a particular relation to you, I can't just stick somebody in my stead, right? And so I'm not sure how you can transfer that. So to me, when you say like, here, take these babies or take these gametes, it sounds too much like, well, now that you lost your job, my dear husband, I don't really love you so much anymore. But like Sally, she's into it, so she'll take over, right? I think if you've promised your love to somebody, it seems an inadequate way to fulfill your obligation to sub somebody else in. Another problem that I have with the analogy to an adoption case is that I don't think it's analogous. There are differences between the way the responsibility is incurred and transferred. So adoption is a post-fact response to a problem that we find ourselves with. We have a child that needs care, and parents who are either unwilling or unable to care for it. So we got to do something about it. Okay, so that's the best we can do, is have somebody else take care of the child. That is different from deliberately setting this situation up in advance, right? And so I don't really think that the analogy holds so closely. But even if it did hold, I think that I'm sorry, I forgot some of the other disanalogies, which is that adoptive parents, and this has been raised, adoptive parents are screened and selected with greater care and screened for the ability to perform the responsibilities that they're supposed to do. And parents who relinquish their children for adoption are often able to say, I gave you up because I loved you, right? They can do so as an expression of love for their child, whose needs they can't meet, right? I couldn't take care of you. I loved you so much that I gave you to somebody who could take care of you because I couldn't, right? It's hard to see how gamete donation can be framed as an expression of love for the child. Like, what are you going to say to this grown child? I loved you so much that I sold the gametes from which you grew to somebody else. Right? That's another disanalogy between the cases of adoption and the cases of gamete donation. And finally, in my view, adoption is not this ideal that we should strive to emulate. I mean, it can turn out very happily for all concerned. I'm not talking about that. But it's not uncommon for adoptees to wonder why they were relinquished for adoption, to struggle with questions of identity, self-esteem, and feelings of rejection. They tell us this. This is their testimony. I accept that this is how a lot of adoptees feel, not all adoptees at all. But and the adoptees that are very happy with their lives and with their situations might feel differently if they discovered that their parents relinquished them just because they're like, why not? Or somebody else wanted you, or somebody gave me money for you, or I intended this in the first place, instead of the thought that most people have, which is the case in almost all adoptions, that the parents were not in a position to take care of the child. My point here is that adoption is not clearly this ideal that we should follow in cases where we're not confronted with an existing child that needs to be cared for. That's my response to this kind of deeper worry about the hazmat view. Another this is probably the deepest worry about the hazmat view, is that it leaves infertile couples or gay couples with much fewer options for having children. And so some philosophers really object strenuously to the hazmat theory of parental responsibility because it implies that gamete donation or sale, right, is morally problematic, and it erects this really strong moral barrier to couples who want to have biologically related children. And so Rebecca Kukla, Sarah Conley, Andrew Botterill, they've all argued along these lines, objecting to the hazmat view. And I do think it's very sad and troubling when people who are capable of parenting and want to be parents are not able to do so, right? I think raising a child or being a parent is one of life's most meaningful and uniquely fulfilling experiences. So I don't take the fact that the hazmat theory of parental responsibility makes it harder for some infertile people or for some gay adults to have that life experience. I really don't take this lightly. But I also don't think that we have a right to any means necessary to get to something that we may have a legitimate interest in pursuing and in having. So if you consider romantic love, right, falling in love with somebody, having a partner, that is also one of life's uniquely fulfilling and meaningful experiences. I mean, okay, it can be. It isn't, but I think it is. And we might think people have a right to pursue it, and I think that they do. But it doesn't mean that they have a right to pursue romantic love by any means necessary, right? You can't kidnap your intended love or woo them with deceptive means or in creepy ways, even if it all works out happily in the end, right? It still doesn't justify it. So our interest in romantic love, which is also strong and very important, doesn't give us that right. And so that is my response to this objection, that having an interest in something or a right to pursue something doesn't mean you have a right to pursue it in any way that is possible, and it also doesn't give you a right to the result that you want. A further sort of worry I have, or something that I think about when people are talking about infertile couples or gay couples who want a genetically related child, is that there seems to be a contradiction in their position, because if you're valuing the genetic relationship and then you're saying that the child should not value the genetic relationship, and that seems to be a contradiction. Although I do have to say that sometimes it is not the genetic relationship that's valued, but that adoption can be difficult, right? Adoption can be exclusionary, can be expensive. Wanting a genetic connection is not the only reason that people pursue gamete donation, but it is not an uncommon reason, and in that way it seems a contradictory position to hold. But let's get back to the question of rights, right? Do people have a right to become parents or use gamete donation or sale to do so? So I find that rights talk, because a human right, it's very loose and kind of insufficient. It's not, what are the principles that it's based on? What does it mean to have a right? So I want to take a little interlude to explore the concept of rights and then talk about how they might apply to the ethics of gamete donation or sale. So what are rights? I think there are two kinds of rights: moral rights and political rights. A moral right, I think, is the right. Where do these rights come from? We hear them invoked all the time, but I think that they need to be theoretically grounded. So very roughly speaking, moral rights can be thought of as the kind of accord or attitude, regard, and behavior that we owe to other people due to each person's status as a person with moral capacity, moral standing, moral interest, and autonomy. So moral rights require us to respect other people as ends in themselves. We're not going to use them for purposes, and demand that we respect each person's sphere of authority. And this is a Kantian-inspired explanation, because Kant's theory of morality is based on rights and respect, and it's principle-based, as opposed to consequentialism, which is another theory, moral theory that's outcomes-based. So that's what I think a moral right is. A political right is different. So moral rights apply from one person to the next, and political rights apply to people in a common political arrangement. So very roughly speaking, political rights can be thought of as what we owe to each other on the basis of our shared cooperation in a society and our obligation to distribute the benefits of that cooperation fairly. And this is a Rawlsian-inspired explanation, because it's Rawls' theory of political justice is foundational to rights-based as opposed to outcome-based political theory. So this is sort of what I think rights are about. So how do they apply to gamete donation and sale? You might think that it's just a property right. You own your gametes and you have a right to sell your stuff. Your gametes belong to you, so it might seem reasonable to think that you both have the moral and the political right to sell them or to give them away, right? Just as you have the moral and political right to sell or give away your extra potatoes, right? This is your stuff. You can do what you want with it. But it's not really so simple, because we morally and politically, we restrict people's property rights. We constrain sale of goods in many ways and for many reasons, right? We don't let people sell their kidneys because we're worried about exploitation. We're worried about disrupting the equitable system of organs for people who need organs. We don't let people mark up the price of batteries in a blackout because we think that that's an unacceptable exploitation of people's vulnerability. We don't even let people, let's say, cut their spouses or their minor children out of their wills if they die, because we think they owe them something, even if they don't. So property rights are extremely not absolute. We constrain them in a lot of ways. And so if selling gametes is an unacceptable abdication or an unacceptable transfer of parental responsibility, that would be a justification for restricting your property rights in this area. So we can't steal your gametes, your property, but we can restrict you from selling them. It's not because if we have good enough reason, the same way that we restrict property rights in other ways. So what about the right to parent or to procreate, right? We might think that of a possible right to parent a child as one that people might have because they have this interest in this uniquely meaningful relationship. And respect for people as having moral authority over their lives and to formulate and pursue their own conception of the good might include respect for the right to pursue procreation and parenting, but rights can be constrained by responsibilities that you might have in pursuit of them. So, and the standard of care that's appropriate to that pursuit. So, in pursuit of the right to get to my job in the morning, I need to drive safely. I can't jump the turnstile. Similarly, in pursuit of my interest in procreation and being a parent, it can be constrained by the relevant responsibility, right? Even though if I say, well, I can't get to work unless I speed, still can't speed, even though I have an interest in getting to work. And so if, as I argue, parental responsibility is incurred by allowing the gametes in your possession and control to join with others and become person, and if, as I also argue, parental responsibilities are not transferable, then gamete donation or sale is not one of the routes that I can take in pursuit of my interest in becoming a parent. What about a political right? So we might think that we have the political right to use societal resources to help us in our pursuit of our interest in procreation and parenting, because that's what political rights govern. They govern how we share our resources and the benefits of our cooperation. And whether that political right makes sense in a particular society might depend on the interaction and the extent of the wealth or the resources that the society has to share. And so it's possible that in contemporary wealthy society, fertility treatments is a political right. We might have ways that we can argue we have political rights to pursue or to get help in our pursuit of procreation and parenthood. But it's hard to see how that's going to translate into a right to use donated or sold gametes if the rest of the hazmat theory is correct, right? Because political rights are also constrained, just like moral rights, by other factors, including the relevant responsibilities in the interest of others, you can't speed, et cetera. Same rules apply. So if we're parentally responsible for allowing or orchestrating the gametes in our control to result in the creation of a child, then we can't violate that responsibility. Just as we can't violate our other responsibilities in the pursuit or the exercise of our other political responsibilities. The last right I'm going to talk about is there a right to be raised by your biological parents? Because Botterill objects to the hazmat theory on this basis. He's like, well, you don't have the right to be raised by your biological children. Well, did you hear me say this? I did not say this. I did not say the hazmat theory of parental responsibility does not assume a right of children to be raised by their genetic parents. It just says you have a responsibility to take care of the gametes under your possession and control. And so it includes, instead, I've argued on the basis of our legal and moral systems of responsibility for the risks we take with the dangerous materials under our possession and control by doing the things we want to do, that gamete owners are responsible for the risks that they take, right? And so I don't argue directly at all for a child's right to be parented by its biological parents. Instead, I'm arguing for the responsibility of gamete owners to take care of what happens with their gametes, and that they have parental responsibility if they use and control their gametes in such a way that it grows into a person. Finally, I'm going to leave you with a little crude example. Right, if nothing that I have said so far is persuasive to you, how are we going to differentiate between an accidental father, right, between Joe sperm donor who donates sperm, intending for them to be used to create a child that he will have nothing to do with and no responsibility for, and Joe Blow, who creates a child accidentally because there was a hole in his condom? None of the theories that I've discussed will make this distinction. Neither of them intended to be parents. Neither of them, actually, Joe's sperm donor intended to be a parent. Joe Blow did not. So when you have a distinction, it doesn't cut the intuitions that a lot of people have. Many people have the intuition that Joe's sperm donor is not responsible and Joe Blow is responsible. But what theory is going to let you do this, right? If you haven't, Joe's sperm donor, Joe's sperm donor didn't intend to be a parent, right? They intended to create a child, but not create a parent. So on some views, you can say that neither intended to raise a child. But you certainly can't say that Joe Blow had the intention and Joe's sperm donor did not. They're both genetically related. They're both causally involved, right? And the hazmat theory also holds them both responsible. You're not going to find a theory that's going to allow you to have this contradictory result of holding Joe Blow responsible, like many people want to, and Joe's sperm donor not responsible. So you're going to have to pick one of those theories, and I think you should pick mine because I think it is the most theoretically grounded in our concepts and not an ad hoc theory, and in our concepts in our views, and not just our views, in what it means to be responsible for dangerous things that you own and control. Thank you.
Before we start the discussion, I want to point out that although I said that the live stream is not showing the images of members of the audience, it turns out that yesterday some people sitting in the first couple of rows stood up to ask their questions and faced the camera. And there's no way to video the speaker without then videoing those people. If you were one of the people who stood up yesterday, you should speak to me. And if you do not want your image on the live stream, please don't turn around and face the camera. Okay? All right, questions. Erin.
I'm wondering your thoughts. Do you think it's permissible for, like, in a situation where there's like a male and female person who mash their gametes together and create a human being, if one of those people has the right to recuse the other from parental responsibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, I don't, because I think, and so what I think your question raises is two kinds of responsibility we have when we create a child. We have a responsibility in the usual case to the person we create a child with, because it takes two so far to create a child, and then you're both parentally responsible. But you also have a separate responsibility to the child, and so I don't see how one party can excuse the other of a responsibility to the child, because the child was not a party to this. The child wouldn't say, like, oh yeah, you're off the hook. And we see this in cases, I actually know somebody, one of my husband's friends, who, many years ago, a woman asked him, like, do me a favor, I want to have a baby, let me have this baby, you don't have to do anything. And that is what happened. They had this baby. I don't think he even knows where the child is or anything like that. But in my view, he has abdicated his parental responsibilities, because those are responsibilities to the child, and those are different than the responsibilities you have to the person you create a child with.
Hi, thank you very much. I would love to just tell you that I think this presentation is something I'd love to have the donor-conceived community bring to Congress to help legislate for it. And it's very brilliant, and we are very grateful to you for putting this together and your thinking on this.
Thank you.
If we can get ourselves organized appropriately and speak with one voice, this is something we really need to speak with you about.
I'll send you the PowerPoint if you want.
Please, please. That being said, my question is regarding the comparison with blood donation, because in our groups and in talking to our biological fathers or parents, a lot of times we hear this, that it's analogous to blood donation. And I would love to get your thinking on how we can respond to that. I know you mentioned the organ donation, but really, blood is just a carrier of nutrients, so it's even less than organs in terms of its comparison. So I'd love to hear your point on that.
So there's a few things I can say in response to that. The first, I think the most important difference between donating blood and donating sperm is the reason you're donating it. So when people donate sperm, if you're donating sperm to be studied for scientific reasons, that's fine. That's not going to become a person. When you donate blood, if you donated blood so that other people can use it to create a person, it would be the same problem as if you donated sperm. So it's the purpose it's being used for, and the purpose it is being used for creates a person with moral status and rights that is different from very different, completely different from blood donation, which is just a product that is not used to become a person. If we could somehow create a person out of blood in the future, it would be the same thing. You would have the same level of responsibility if you created it for, if you were donating it for that purpose, or if you knew that that would be done with it. Another thing I would say about the difference in organ donation, like we have rules against selling kidneys. Those rules are usually intended to protect the seller. We don't want people to be exploited. Deborah Satz has a book called Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale, and she talks about kidney donation, and she says that in countries where kidney donation is either allowed or happens when it's not allowed, kidneys are used as collaterals and loans. Like if you owe somebody money and you say, well, I don't have the money to pay it back, then the person will say to you, well, you have a kidney. And so the rules against organ sale are usually intended to protect the seller. But when we're thinking about sperm donation, we don't need to protect the seller because it's a renewable resource. That's why it's considered like blood. In terms of, I think, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a doctor, but what I understand is that we allow people to sell things that are replenishable. So you can sell your blood, you can sell your sperm because it's replenishable. And that's fine if you're thinking about protecting the seller, right? You can't sell your kidney, not replenishable. Blood, sperm are replenishable. But when we're thinking about gamete donation, and we're thinking about selling sperm, we're protecting not the seller, not the recipient, but the person that grows from the intended result of that activity. So I think you have a very strong response to that analogy.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Can you just talk a little more about how far the responsibility goes? Because you suggested a bit that we have a responsibility to love people we've promised to love, but there doesn't seem to be a promise here that, I have gametes, I promise to love my gametes when they grow into humans. So at what point does this, if a child is born, what is the responsibility that the gamete holder has? So
the responsibility is not based on a promise like it might be in a marital commitment or something like that. It's based on the responsibility to, like, to sort of mitigate the damages and take care of the milk that you spilled. And right, and so the way you take care of spilled milk is by cleaning it up, and the way you take care of a baby is by raising it, which includes loving it. And so I think that responsibility not only goes very far, but it runs very deep. And I've actually written about this because I think we have responsibility to our children throughout their lives. It doesn't just end like 18, party's over. What's this magic number? If on my view, your responsibilities to a child are based on the risks that you impose on them by having, living a life. You live your life your whole life. And so the responsibilities, I think, from parents to children are lifelong. But I don't think it's based on a promise. I think it's based on a responsibility to take care of the hazardous materials under your possession and control.
Okay, so unlike the spilled milk, so I could just ask someone else.
Right. So the difference is that people clean up spilled milk the same way. Take a paper towel, you wipe up the milk. And so but a responsibility to love somebody is unique and specific and is done very differently by different people. So once you're in that position already, if no one is in the position of loving the child, maybe anybody can step in and do just as good a job or even a better job than the biological parents. So lots of biological parents are terrible parents. It's really hard to be a parent. Most people are not good at it. But if you are already I think you're already in that position. You're already promised, or not promised, you're already obligated to love that person, then you can't step out. That's like saying, well, you lost your job, now I don't love you, but my friend is willing to. At least that's my view. Because you've allowed this to happen with the dangerous possession under your responsibility and control, and so that responsibility means you have to take care of them. You have to clean up the spilled milk, you have to love the child, and now that's hard to transfer.
Loved your talk.
Thank you.
Just did.
This is a very new experience for me.
We all love you. I'm assuming the hazmat theory would support surrogate mother who would carry a baby if the sperm and the egg were donated from the parents, and that the mother just couldn't carry it because she had a hysterectomy or she was a heart transplant patient. But that would be okay. Your theory would approve of that.
Yes, because that's just, that's like the oven you're baking the bun in. It's not the bun.
So I confess I feel a little. Is this on? It's on. Okay.
Yeah.
I feel a little uncomfortable about presenting any objection to you, given the
Why?
context in which we are. But I'm gonna try anyway. So. There are 2 points that you are making. So one is whether sperm donors have responsibilities and what those responsibilities are, because they are clearly not doing this accidentally. Okay, so that's one issue. And then it's your hazmat that applies to everybody, whether or not they are. So your claim, I mean, you make many claims, many of them, that would require more time than you have there. So. But one is that is consistent with notions of risks and responsibilities that we have in our society. But those notions of risks might be completely problematic. So it's not clear why we should take that as a good thing. For example, we tend to assume that women have significantly more responsibility for their babies than men. And, well, I think someone should give me some reason for why that is a good thing. So that's one problem. The other problem is, so you have 2 claims. One is we are responsible for our hazardous materials. And the other, that we cannot transfer that. And we cannot transfer, as you just mentioned, because of somehow we are required to love, or we have a responsibility to love. But why?
Okay.
The fact that we have something that can create a life means, at most, perhaps, one can argue that I am responsible for ensuring that that child has a good life, is loved by someone, so it might be that some practices are just wrong because we cannot ensure that, but you haven't given any reason whatsoever that says that I have to love the child simply because I am the one who is,
I've given
has
a
this
reason.
material.
You're not persuaded by the reason, but let me, but
Well,
I
the
can, I
reason
will
is simply
explain.
that I have
yeah.
those materials, but one
No,
is
that's
having those
okay.
materials.
So it's not just that you have them. So let me answer your questions, the first one first. So I agree that I'm not just saying like, well, this is how we handle responsibility in our messed up culture. So let's just go with that. So thank you for the opportunity for me to explain this a little bit further. It's not that, oh, this is what we think, because actually what I'm saying is not what a lot of people think. It's that we have a framework that I think is, and I've given some of the explanation of that framework, for the way that we handle responsibility for the hazardous materials under our possession and control in our society, for the way that we handle risk imposition, that I do think has good arguments behind it. So I've explained a little bit how when we think about whether we should permit a risk, or what our ethics or our rules are about risk imposition, we think about what would it cost you not to impose the risk? What would it cost the person to be harmed by the risk? So it's not just, oh, this is what we do, but this is the framework that we have that I think has good arguments to support it. And so that is my reason for that. And so when I say it fits into our views, it's not that it fits into our views. It fits into the framework that we have theoretical reasons to support. And I think the framework has a theoretical grounding that is persuasive and makes sense, like this societal contract kind of basis, and the way that we should take responsibility for the hazardous materials under our control, possession and control, and also the way that that hazmat theory applies to gamete donation. So it's not just this is what we think, but this is a framework that we have, and this is the social contract kind. It's not a social. I wouldn't say social contract. This is a fair framework we have for adjudicating risks and responsibilities, the interests we all have in being secure from harm and in being able to live our lives freely. So that's the basis for it. Let me move on to your second question about why do I have a responsibility to love? I did breeze this by very quickly, so let me backtrack a little bit. I think that if you let your gametes join with others and become people, then you have a responsibility to take care of a child. I think that one of the things you must do to take care of a child is to love that child. So the child is born, and I would hope that's not a controversial statement. Although, actually, Professor Velleman has written about the duty to love, so I don't know if you agree with this. But so you have this response. You're born in that, not born, you're in this position. The baby is born, you're in a position of parental responsibility, which I think includes the responsibility to love, because that's what a child needs in order to grow into their potential. and live the life that you should try to have, to help them toward. And so you're born into that. I mean, you're not. They're born, and you are in that position by virtue of being in position of parental responsibility. And so you then can't. I don't think it's so easily transferred, because that is part of what it means to be parentally responsible.
I will say, being a donor-conceived person, I absolutely enjoyed listening to everybody who has presented themselves here, regardless of whether or not I agree with the theology or the underlying personal opinions. I think it's important for the industry as a whole to understand the cause and effect of somebody like a Joe sperm donor or somebody like a Joe Blow. At the end of the day, there is sperm that comes out of a male reproductive system. There is ovum or eggs that come out of a female reproductive system, and once those two are joined, I think all of us have a responsibility to nurture, protect, and love the children across the entire continent. This isn't just a US thing. This is we collectively need to have a voice to protect not just the sperm donor. I would disagree. I don't expect my sperm donor to love me. I think that it would be great if he would show his face, but I don't need him to love me. I believe self-love is something that has come from the road I have traveled, which has not been an easy road, to be honest with you. I think for somebody like the two ladies who I highly respect sitting in the second row, we have a choice in life, and some of us aren't given those choices. And I think that that's kind of the underlying reason why we enjoy the latest presenters, because there's truth behind the fact that we are not here because we chose to be here. Hi, 44 years ago, my sperm donor delivered 5 samples at Harvard University, and yay, here I am. This is a road that took 24 years for me to be comfortable in my own seat, and I do agree that there has to be a level of something judicial, something meaningful, moral, a compass, a single fundamental collective something. And I don't know what that is, and I'm glad that we're here trying to figure that out, because this is what it's come to.
So I know you're interested primarily in the theoretical aspects of this, but I want to ask, one implication for purposes of donor conception would be that government prohibit donor conception. And so I want to think, drawing on Nina's comments, on in other areas of life where we're not talking about donor conception, what are the consequences for government policy? So the backdrop is a world in which lots of children are being raised, one, not by both of their genetic parents. Is the microphone just not working? Not by both of their genetic parents, or by people who are not their genetic parents. And there's a way in which this might suggest that those relationships are ones that should be avoided or discounted. And so I guess I'm wondering, what are the implications in other areas of government policy? So one, does the government have an obligation to provide contraception? We're moving as far away from that as possible. Two, does the government should the government be prohibiting abortion? And three, does the government have an obligation to find genetic fathers of children produced through sexual procreation, even given the backdrop of a gender division of labor in which women bear the disproportionate burdens of child rearing and might have very good reasons not to have the genetic father involved in the child's life, that there's still an obligation of the genetic father to that child?
So I appreciate the opportunity to say that. So in my book, where I talk about what I think procreative responsibilities are, I specifically say that, I'm arguing about what I think an individual person's moral responsibilities are, because, as I think you're right to point out, once we're talking about what the law should be, then we get into, right, what the government is coercive. It has coercive powers on us, and it takes a lot stronger of a reason to say that the government has a reason to stop something. So even there, like, I think adultery is morally wrong. You're breaking a promise. I don't think it should be against the law, because you have these problems of who's going to decide, who's going to sanction it, what the sanction is going to be. You have so many other things that are more complicated when you're dealing with a political question about what a government should do or not do. However, I do think that there are some things, like where we don't allow for, we don't allow people to kill each other, right? There's some things where we say, okay, our government is going to step in and do something. And so I'm not just going to hide behind this, like, well, I'm only talking morally. I don't know what the policy should be. I do think there are some policy implications that I am comfortable with. And one of them is, yes, I think sperm donation, gamete donation should certainly not be allowed in its current, the way it is currently allowed. I would be much happier. I mean, I think it's wrong, so I don't think people should do it. I'm not gonna not say what I already said and pretend I didn't say it. But I also think in terms of, so I think sperm donation, egg donation, I do think that should be against the law. But at least we should have no anonymity, not just no anonymity. We should have an expectation of some kind of screening, involvement, that if somebody donates sperm, they should have an idea of where it's going. Somebody, I don't think that gentleman is here today, but somebody talked yesterday and said, like, well, should I have to give a kidney if it's my child? I'm like, yeah, I think you should, yeah. And so, however, I would not make that the law, that you have to give your kidney, right? Because that's already very deeply involved in somebody else's body. Same thing with abortion. I would not legislate about abortion, because I think that creates the problems with because I think it's a woman's right to her bodily integrity, and things like that, a political right, whatever the moral view is. So you've asked about a few different, do I think it's the government's responsibility to provide contraception, sex education? Absolutely. Certainly, if I think that we have such a high degree of responsibility for the gametes under our possession and control, and that's constantly undercut by the way we don't talk about anything, by suppression of sex education, by not providing free contraception, by not paying for people's contraception, that does create this problem where we're holding people responsible, or I'm holding people responsible to a standard that the government is making it harder to meet. And so I do think that is something I would agree with, that kind of legislation. So again, just in general, I think that there is a difference between a moral standard and a legal standard, but it's not that none of the things I'm saying would have more legal implications.
The last one is the most difficult one. Does the government have the obligation to actually find genetic fathers when in the background of the division of labor, it's women bearing responsibilities for children?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think the government does have a responsibility to find genetic fathers, and because it's a responsibility to the child. I think the child has a right to know their father, to relate to some relationship with their father, and to support.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think one of the reasons why many of the discourses that were out there yesterday felt so dismissive and ignorant to the lived experiences of donor-conceived people is because they were centering the experiences of recipient parents and also centering the experiences of children, when really, as you can see in this room, there are so many of us who are adults. So my question to you is, the level of responsibility you feel is judicially possible towards mitigation of harm with respect to adult donor-conceived people?
So again, like I said, I mean, legally, what we are going to agree to have in law is different from what a moral standard is, because the government has these powers of sanction. You can think of problems with abuse and all kinds of other problems that arise when we give a government a lot of power over people. But I do think, again, what I think is possible to legislate is, first of all, is you can ban sperm donation and egg donation. Many countries around the world have done this. You can ban anonymous sperm donation. Almost, most countries have done this. And you can also require, paternal involvement, as we do in everyday cases. We carve out this special exception for gamete donation, and people do that on the basis of an analogy to an adoption, which I've argued is not analogous, and is also, if you're talking about the case of gamete donation, is based on, as was raised in the question that was raised earlier, is based on an agreement between the father and the mother, and ignores the rights of the child. And I do think that one of the reasons the legislation has not been focused on children born of gamete donation is because it was a group that had no voice. And also, I want to just acknowledge that many children, or maybe even most children who are donor conceived, are very happy with their lives and have no complaints about it. But those who do find problems with it are only now sort of growing up and organizing, and we're hearing from you. But I was thinking about this 20 years ago, thinking, all right, I'm waiting for these kids to grow up.
So Rivka,
Yes.
thank you so much for your talk. So I want to pick up on what Ima had said. So I mean, first, there are two components to your claim. There's the hazmat theory, and then there's sort of like whether love is transferable or not. And the hazmat theory, I think it's really interesting, but I worry that it suffers the same problem as sort of the causal theory. We all know that this is sort of a dangerous, hazardous material, and the question is like, but the issue is sort of why isn't it transferable, right? So that's the key issue, and I think you kind of slide between. You kind of slide between sort of the child needing to be loved and the child needing your love, right? Those are two different claims, right? And I'm in print. I wrote a book on the right to be loved. So I also in my book claim that everyone has a duty to love every child. So in some ways, I'm very sympathetic to what you're trying to say, but here's the caveat. Here's the caveat. So I also distinguish what I call primary duty bearers and associate duty bearers, right? And so the primary duty bearers are the ones who are supposed to be one discharging the love to, the children. And I guess I'm not seeing why that love couldn't be transferred to somebody else. So I mean, there are sort of so many examples. Just if you just look anthropologically, culturally, et cetera, sometimes parents might not be available. Sometimes it's the grandparents who are doing the loving. Sometimes it's the uncles and aunts, and et cetera. But on your argument, it's like it's only the biological, parent who can provide that. And if they didn't do that, somehow they're failing. And that's just not, it seems like there's plenty of evidence where, I mean, even like in kibbutz, for example, there are sort of kids who grow up raised by grandparents, by uncles and aunts who love them, et cetera, and they seem to flourish. And it depends on the arrangement. And you might think that maybe the biological parent, in the first instance, has the right and the duty to kind of assign to kind of transfer that. But there's nothing in that says that they couldn't transfer that, right? Yeah. So maybe you can just say a bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's just funny to me that you talk about a kibbutz, because the first thing they changed about the kibbutz was that the children should live with the parents. That was the thing that everybody liked the least in that arrangement. When people abandoned, now kibbutzes are not as popular, but the least popular part of living on a kibbutz was that the parents didn't live with the children, didn't raise the children. But that's not part of my argument. So let me talk about why I say the child needs to be loved and that you are responsible to love that child. And I am not saying, my argument is not outcomes-based. It's not like, if you don't love that child, it's going to be terrible. Sometimes somebody else's love is better for the child than yours, right? Because you're not good at this, or you do it in a twisted way, or whatever. And so, why is it that I think that you are that you have this responsibility? Is because I think that parental responsibility, which you have by virtue of what you did with your gametes, so parental responsibility includes, 1, 2, 3, many things, right? You have, take care of the child's needs, feed them, clothe them, love them. And so you are now, by what you've done with your gametes, in that position. You are parentally responsible. So can you farm out the feeding? Yes, because that's like bringing the cake to the party. But you can't farm out the love, because that is something that is a unique and specific performance that people do differently. Is not, in my view, a transferable obligation. So the two things I would say is that once you are parentally responsible, which I think you are, when you donate your gametes for reproductive purposes, you are already standing in that position. It's not like, before. You're in it, and you have this responsibility, and I don't think that this responsibility is transferable, even if it ends up fine.
Yeah, go ahead. So I agree that your love is unique, right? But again, like, why does the child have a right to your unique kind of love? Like, I'm still not getting
Yeah.
the argument.
I didn't say
right?
that the child has a right to it.
Right, but-
you
but
have an
what-
obligation
so-
because you're parentally responsible.
So-
So if you think that love is,
Yeah.
I think the difference between us is that you think that love is a transferable responsibility and that I don't. So because I think it's, and so that's, I think, the point of our disagreement. I think it's not transferable because it's a responsibility to stand in a particular relation to a person and because it's something that people perform very uniquely and differently. So that, I don't think you agree with that, but I think if I want to get to the heart of our disagreement, I think that's where it is.
I'm just going to jump in here. It seems to me that the case that you might want to think about on precisely this disagreement, myself, I think this is where an outcomes-based considerations have to be brought in, and the value of genetic ties has to be brought in. But that's a different, that's a different subject.
I actually do agree that genetic ties have a value. I think it's silly to pretend that they don't. I don't think that they're the only value. I don't even think they're necessarily the most important value, but it seems odd to me to say that they have no value. We're animals, we're mammals. Mammals have genetic ties. People express this view, they feel this, I mean, people have this feeling, it's much discussed, and it's also presented as a reason for people wanting to, gamete donors so that they can have a genetically related child. So I agree that there's maybe an implicit appeal that I don't appeal to directly because I don't make an argument for it, but I can see the point of what you're
So
saying.
the case that I wanted to suggest that you think about is the case in which someone has taken an undue risk or been negligent in control of risky materials, if you like. Damage is done. Now, suppose a stranger, harm is done, damages are owed. Suppose a stranger steps forward and says, okay, I'll pay the damages, you are off the hook. So this is not about the specific performance required of love. This has to do with what we think with the model of risk and harm, which is that we don't, I don't think, and Doug can probably say more about how the law works on this, but we don't think that it's enough that the party harmed be made whole by just anyone.
Right. Sometimes you can sue for specific performance. That's why.
Well, I don't just mean you can sue for, even if it's not specific performance.
Yeah.
Let it just be money damages. Is it sufficient that an anonymous philanthropist comes forward and compensates the injured party, or do we really think that the person responsible has to compensate the injured party?
That's really interesting. That reminds me of a paper I wrote that nobody read called "It Ain't My World," where I make this argument about, the person who spilled the milk is the person who has to clean it up, and so I tend to agree with that, but I haven't argued for that position here.
So I have a question that might be useful, since I'm not in the world of philosophy and ethics. I'm in the world of clinical psychology, and if you could, since I have the sense that your argument is controversial from the way that you've been presenting it, and certainly there are thousands of children, adults, born with assisted conception here and around the world. So the history of countries making these decisions and ethical debates going on goes back at least 100 years. Could you speak a little bit to the history of the ethical debate about donor conception that you're participating in, so that we can have a context for your ideas?
It would be, I'm not, so that's, I'm not going to have a good answer for you because I've read about the history, but I'm not as deeply familiar with it as maybe you think I need to be, because I'm coming at it from a point of like, this is what I think about the principles, and this is what it should, this is what I think the morality of the case is. I think the way in which, but one thing I will say about the history of the ethics of donor conception and most reproductive technologies is that they were driven by the people who had the money to pay for them and the interest in them. And so, one thing I think that has been missing from the historical debate about assisted reproductive technologies is the children that are born from those technologies. And so, a lot of times people will say, well, most people are happy to be born. That's a whole other philosophical debate that I've written a lot about, because I think nobody needs to be born. Doesn't harm you at all if you're not born. There's no subject for this problem, and so I take that out of the consideration. Like, oh, great, you get to be born, yay. No, that's just neither here nor there. It's not a consideration to me. But I think that's one of the reasons why you haven't seen a lot of that in the debate, which is like, well, here's a child born to a loving family, they're lovingly raised, like, stop complaining. And so I think part of the history, when I think of the history of these debates, and the way the evolution of the laws has come about, especially in the United States, has been driven by who has the interest, right? So a lot of studies are not done. Studies, even things like IVF, there's not a lot of studies on the long-term risk for the mothers or egg donation going through these very, significant hormonal injections that you might think will have effect. There's very little studies done because who wants the studies? Not the people who want the treatment, not the doctors who are providing the treatment. And so that is part of the history of the debate that I think has been left out, but I still think my answer to you is not full or adequate, because I'm probably not as familiar with some of the parts of the history of this debate that you might be thinking about.
Thank you very much for this. I will continue to echo what the DDC people have said. There was one item on your slide that really resonated with me. You said, we don't have a right to any means necessary to get what we may legitimately have a strong interest in having. I flipped that around from the parental side to the child side, and then later you said that children don't have a right to, maybe I
said
misunderstood.
I didn't argue for it. I
Okay.
didn't say that. It's not part of my argument.
I am curious, though, what is your response to a child who wants, by any means necessary, a relationship with a parent that is not interested in participating?
So that's a really interesting question. I do think that parents have the obligation to have a relationship with their biological children, and so that gives the child sort of this derivative right from the obligation to have, but I certainly don't think a child has the right to any means necessary. You can't show up with a gun, right? But so any means necessary, of course, because I'm not an outcomes-based philosopher, I do a much more principle-based Kantian way of thinking. And so, yes, there would be restrictions on what you could do to pursue what you have an interest in on both sides, yes.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask about the responsibilities of the fertility doctors and lab techs on your view. So you said it was an advantage of your view over some of the other accounts, that it wouldn't count them as having parental responsibilities. But if I borrow your car and I go run down a pedestrian, I would have a moral responsibility. If I take your pet lion for a walk, or I run a lion walking service, depending on the details, it depends, am I negligent, am I reckless, am I actually actively looking to sick lions on people? So depending on the details, I could be more morally responsible, or at least as responsible as you, even though you own the hazardous material, right? So I think it's more consistent with our norms of risk and responsibility to say that the people who are involved in creating this outcome where someone is harmed or put in an ED situation are equally responsible or more responsible, depending on the details of the case.
Yeah.
Again.
So,
Sorry, I'm going to take sorry, I want to make an intervention here just to further illustrate your point, which is if we are saying sperm donors are actually sperm vendors and they are selling the sperm, then the fertility clinic is the one who has possession and control of the sperm.
not initially. So,
No, not initially.
Yeah,
I understand
yeah.
that.
So, okay. So
I thought that this was a reinforcement
yes.
of your point.
I think it is. I think that, so I do think that fertility doctors, I think they have a responsibility. I don't think it's the responsibility, because the initial ownership and control is the gamete owners. And because I think that responsibility cannot be transferred, I think that that stays with the gamete owners. But let me take some of your analogies. So if we think about the case of the pet lion, where you have strict liability, if I lend you my pet lion to go for a walk and you let it off the leash, I am still responsible. You're also bad. You're also responsible. But I am no less responsible because I had a pet lion and I didn't take care of it. I shouldn't have given it to you. Now, so I believe you're a responsible walker. But actually, I mean, if I own a pet lion, I am not allowed to give the lion to anybody or if I have a dangerous dog. But if you think about something like a car, here I think it's because responsibilities of driving a car are transferable, right? I can say you're a good driver because you're a licensed driver. I have insurance for you. There's a lot of steps we take before you can drive my car. Can't let my kid drive my car. I can't let somebody unlicensed drive my car. And so that is some of the differences in the transferability and in the way we transfer. One thing I think that your question does argue for is it would be a much more responsible transfer of responsibility if we licensed, sperm recipients. If it was a more responsible transfer, it would become more similar to the car case, and then the only difference would be my view about needing to love the child and not having that be a responsible transfer. But thank you for your question. That's a good question.
Thanks very much, Rivka. So I wanted to ask about the transfer argument as well. In your book, you make two arguments against transfer. One is based on real-world practice and suggests that the way that transfer happens now is utterly reckless. That seems right. I want to set that aside. The argument you've made here is a principled argument against transfer. Suppose I grant what it seems like a number of people won't grant, which is that once a relationship has been established, it cannot be a loving relationship. You can't transfer except in extraordinary circumstances. Why can't the obligations be transferred in prospect? So there's a significant time lag, right? I mean, there can be between donation or selling, and then the creation of the thing to which responsibilities are owed.
Yes.
And it seems strange to me to suggest that you have before the child even exists, that you're not in a relationship then, a loving relationship. Yeah. So why can't it, in principle, why couldn't it be transferred in prospect?
So I think it's a good question, and I've thought of that myself actually, because I think that once you donate your gametes, once you say you open the gate, the minute you open that gate, you are parentally responsible. So I think that because you are now allowing your hazardous materials under your possession and control to grow into a person, that puts you in a position of parental responsibility. So I think our disagreement is when that clock starts ticking. You open the gate, I think it starts ticking. I think you think it starts ticking when there's a person. I don't think so. I think you open the gate and it starts ticking. But thank you for the question. It's a good question. Appreciate it.
Okay, so I need you to clarify, because this is what I'm hearing from one of your points. So do you believe that, since you say that people should, just because they want to be parents, shouldn't be able to pursue it by any means necessary, right? So for gay people, if they want to become parents, should only then be able to access adoption and foster care in order to become parents, because donation of gametes is too risky of a behavior, or is going to not be the the means aren't equal to what you want, right? The risk is too high. So if you're saying that then they should only be able to access adoption and foster care, if they can't access that due to law in the state or financial barriers, whatnot, are you asking that they choose between their sexual orientation or their desire to be a parent?
I don't think that's what I'm doing. I understand why you think that result is that sometimes somebody is confronted with that choice. But the way I think about it is, I don't think people choose their sexual orientation, that's not in any way part of my view. But I do think the by any means necessary still holds, and I think that, like I said, I think the the outcome of having gay couples or, not able to have their own children, or like you said, a lot of times, I'm not one of these people who says, just adopt. I know it's very hard to adopt, and it's not available to everybody. So it is a high cost of my view, but I'm not going to pretend it's not a cost. So I think that, yes, the means don't justify the ends for me. Right, the ends don't justify the means. Sorry, that's the opposite. The ends don't justify the means to me.
They either can love who they want to love, be in same-sex partnership, and not parent if they can't access those, adoption or those existing ways to be parents, or they can't have that, and then they can go out in a heterosexual relationship and be a parent.
I wouldn't say that I'm asking them to choose, because I'm just saying that given this is the person that you are, these are the limitations that apply to everybody when thinking about how you can morally pursue procreation and parenthood, and it presents an obstacle for you that I am not removing. It's that I accept as an outcome that's unfortunate and tragic, but I don't think that it justifies the means that I think are not acceptable.
Hi. My question was going back to the sort of discussion we were having a little bit ago about parental responsibility to love. Do you argue that genetic parents are capable of providing a specific type of love, not that it is better or worse than the love that could be provided by grandparents or adoptive parents or anyone else, but that genetic parents are capable of a certain type of love that only they are capable of, and that if you release your gametes, that is part of the contract?
I don't know. I do not argue that genetic parents have special loving capabilities that other people don't have. Some genetic parents are very bad at loving anybody. I argue that it's their responsibility to love their child, and that responsibility cannot be transferred. But I don't think that genetic parents have special capabilities or are better at necessarily being parents at all.
Hi. Okay. From my understanding, what you're talking about in here is regarding anonymous donation, mostly, especially regarding gay families and single parents and everything. I think it's a very...
She said all donors have this responsibility. That's what she said. All donors.
Yes, I did say that.
Yeah,
I think it is...
Yes. All donors do, but when it comes to having, like, the right to have a biological family, like romantic love, I think it's a very different circumstance with anonymous donations and having an open donor.
Yes. Yes, I do think that it is much worse when it's anonymous.
Oh, yeah.
And it's much worse when you don't have a relationship. But I am owning up to what I said and what I argue for, which is that I think
I'm not
all
going
donations
against that, but
are
I do think when there is an open donor who is willing to be in the life of the child, and it's an agreement in all parties where it's...
It's not all parties. The child doesn't agree.
All parties who can attest to this, meaning the parents in question. But kind of on another note, what are your thoughts on VARTA, like the VARTA Acts in Australia, where...
Can you, I don't think I know that.
So the Victorian Assisted Reproduction Something Act. Okay, and so in 1996 in Victoria, Australia, there was a law passed where from there on, any donors had to be open.
Mm-hmm.
Like there could be, it was
Right.
an end to anonymous donation.
Right.
What?
Yeah, retro.
I think in 2006 it was passed where if you were conceived before 1996, you would have records to everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was 2006, it may have been later, where it was just completely open for everyone, and then that's where all the kickbacks started, where these donors had signed these agreements to be completely anonymous. Where I know you talk about like kind of perspective and like the principle of it, but in your opinion, where, like, if we pass that here?
So one of the things that's interesting, so I think prospective laws are much less problematic because then the person is signing and they and that's what's kept. And so if you say no, from here on in, no more anonymous donation, then that's fair to all parties easily, I think. But if you say that it's retroactive, people will, one of the problems with that is that somebody now has an agreement, or they gave something with they were assured of something that they're no longer assured of. I think the interest of the children is stronger, and I would support the retroactive cases, because I think the same way that in adoption we said, okay, records are open, I don't see why this is not the same thing.
Wait.
Did you hand the, go ahead.
Yeah, simple theoretical question that's going to take us a little bit of setup, but we're always talking about these practices after the fact, and I want to get ahead of the curve a little bit. One of the technologies currently being researched is the creation of synthetic gametes. Now, in your opinion, is that something that should ever even be entertained due to the fact that a for-profit business is incapable of providing any sort of love, including parental love, other than the love of money, which they're committed to already?
You mean like a company creating gametes and selling them?
From scratch.
Well, I think the company will then be parentally responsible for every child.
But
and have to love that child.
capable of
But,
assuming that
yeah,
level of
yes,
responsibility?
Yes. So I think I would be against that, because I think they would then be, they would have responsibilities that they know from the get-go they would be unable to fulfill.
Hi, I'm Linda Kahn. I'm a reproductive epidemiologist here at NYU, and someone who's very interested in studying the long-term health consequences of ART use among women who participate in it and children who result from it. And I've actually done quite a bit of research into the history of assisted reproduction and artificial insemination. And really what it's grounded in is eugenics. And it is, from the get-go, has been shrouded in secrecy. And basically, it's been human experimentation on women's bodies.
And on the children that result from those.
Absolutely, on the children. So I'm very sympathetic to your point of view. I'm also a reproductive rights advocate, and I'm just concerned, and I want to encourage you to do what you can to try to, and maybe I'm misinterpreting, try to tighten up a couple things. In response to, I think it was your question about surrogacy, your response was that the surrogate does not have any parental responsibility because she does not have ownership of the gametes.
Ownership and control.
Right, and so she is the oven it's being baked in.
If it's not her egg.
I am concerned that that may be in conflict with the bodily integrity argument that underlies Roe v. Wade. So I just want to clarify that, and maybe it's a rights versus responsibility.
No. I think I wasn't clear enough, and thank you for the opportunity to clarify. When I responded to the surrogacy question, what I was saying is that a gestational surrogate does not, in my view, have parental responsibilities. That doesn't give away their rights to bodily integrity. They still retain those rights. There's nothing that I've said that in any way impacts those rights. So I just think they don't have a responsibility to raise they're not parentally responsible to the child. They have other responsibilities. You may have responsibilities as a gestational surrogate or as somebody gestating a baby, all kinds of responsibilities, but they will not be the ones that I've described. And I know you have something else to say, but I just want to say that in terms of many assisted reproductive or reproductive technologies are done without, the first time they're done, the second time they're done, in the beginning when they're done, you don't know what's going to happen. And so, the ICSI, which is a technology where they inject a sperm into an egg, that was done before anybody knew what would happen with it for real. So I think a lot of those cases are experimenting on human subjects without their consent and for no benefit to them. And I think they're very problematic because of that experimental status.
Right. Yeah, totally agree. And the other question I'm a little anxious about is the idea of using the term parental, which implies the existence of a child. And in reproductive rights, we are very careful never to call the gestating fetus a child, because that, again, opens the door to a lot of things that we may not, consequences that may be unintended.
I would accept the consequence. I mean, not accept the consequence, love the consequence, but I think that I think that if you release, I think that the response, I do think it's parental responsibility, and I think that in the case of abortion, so when I think about abortion, I think it's very complicated, and I think that the rights to bodily integrity, you can argue, trump the rights of a fetus, but I am not one who will say that the fetus has no rights, that it's nothing, that it's not a baby until it's born. I'm not so sympathetic to those arguments. So, but I also think that I think it's, to me, more honest, or maybe just more honest to me, more consistent with my views, to say that I do call these things parental responsibilities, but I think that sometimes the right to bodily integrity can trump in cases.
All right, we are out of time. We will reconvene at 1:30. Thank you, Rivka.
Thank you very much. It was a really excellent discussion. I appreciate it.